The looter-shooter genre is in a really interesting space right now, and as we've seen over the years, it's something that a lot of studios have tried to recreate in gaming in general, especially as live service games, and that's where, of course, we're all very familiar with Destiny, which over the course of its lifetime has been one of the most successful live service looter-shooter type games. And of course, in a way, looter-shooter is quite a basic way of actually describing what something like Destiny is, or Warframe, for instance. But it gives us a general idea. Something that's been in the news a little bit more recently is that on the 12th of January, the Anthem servers will be shut down forever. I mean, maybe you heard about it, maybe you don't really care, but there was a time a few years ago where many of us were intrigued at the possibility of Anthem being a successful title in this space. But Anthem was plagued by a lot of difficulties, one of them being that it didn't really even seem to know exactly where it was going. I remember hearing a story about them changing the title of the actual project just hours or like a day before its announcement. At E3, it was previously called Beyond. Then as we went into the launch phase, while Anthem looked pretty cool visually, it was coming into a space where it was competing with games like Destiny, Division. The big gameplay hook for Anthem being the fact that you could fly around, really. Outside of that, in a lot of ways, games like Division and Destiny in particular made the Anthem sandbox look really pretty basic in comparison, and on top of that, while it wasn't strictly a live service game, or maybe that was the aspiration, I'm not really sure at this point, there just was not enough content either, so there were loads of reasons that Anthem was going to struggle. If you happen to want to try and play Anthem, I don't anticipate that many of you guys will, but you have just a final few days until it goes dark forever. We've seen this happen as multiple different studios try and jump on the kind of looter-shooter bandwagon, I suppose. You guys may remember Outriders as well. That actually started its development very shortly after Destiny 1 had been released. It was only like a year later. And again, I think the concept that this would be live service anywhere near at the level that Destiny could do it was pretty unrealistic. We also, of course, in the life cycle of Destiny, had Division 1, which was a relatively successful game, right? Where comparatively, Division 2 kind of struggled, partially because it didn't really build enough on what the game had going for it overall, but also, I think it just never had the appeal or the hook that a game like Destiny did. So while it was certainly played a lot more than many of its competitors, ultimately, when we look at Division now, it has less than a quarter of the active player count of Destiny. Throw into the mix the first Descendant, and of course Suicide Squad, which kind of positioned itself as a looter-shooter. It was very difficult to do, and on the most part, looking in this kind of territory, you have Destiny 2, you have games like Warframe, and of course Borderlands 4 that we had last year, which obviously isn't really a live service game on the same level as some of the other titles we're talking about. It's safe to say that the successful games in this space, on the most part, are the established ones, right? And for a long time, Destiny kind of held the crown as the ultimate live service example. So many studios would have been incredibly jealous of Bungie and what they achieved with Destiny 2. And that's why we've seen so many attempts to recreate something in this space, as it's proven to have a lot of potential. Looking at one of the long-running competitors in a way, but when we compare Warframe right now, Destiny roughly has only a quarter of the player count that Warframe enjoys, which is totally a big credit to the developers, where we see over time they've actually built a bigger and bigger audience for the game. And it stacks up against Destiny 2, obviously having more players currently on PC at least. And it tells us that the looter-shooter RPG space is certainly not dead, but in a lot of ways it is aging, especially in its kind of traditional format. One of the big kind of changes in this space is where we've seen developers kind of smash together elements of looter shooters and the battle royale or extraction genre, which are different but have a lot of similarities. Fundamentally, looting is what they're actually about. The ultimate differences end up being the gameplay mechanics, the format of the game, whether it's open world, explorable, or actual matches, and then of course, other components like whether we have persistent characters, heroes, the level of customization in the abilities, but they kind of boil down to a similar basic concept. And then we've seen big successes like Arc Raiders. And it's kind of interesting that Bungie decided they were going to go the Marathon route at the time they did, only for us to see another title come out just before Marathon and be incredibly successful. So there's obviously a hunger for this type of game, but to get those big mass audiences, as Arc Raiders has done, it's kind of having to push the envelope of what these games can be, but also really deliver on the quality gameplay and the overall vision for what the project actually is. And time will tell whether Bungie can kind of replicate a bit of that with Marathon. In concept, I think that's what they were going for, right? Arc Raiders has proven that something in this space can absolutely work still, but the quality expectation is incredibly high, and that's where there are big questions about Marathon, especially when you combine general sentiment around the Bungie studio, which most of the bad sentiment for Bungie comes from their legacy of players, right? The people who've been playing Destiny for years. In a way, one of the problems for Marathon may actually be that Bungie have boiled it down to more of a basic extraction shooter, where according to Chris Barrett, who was formerly the game director before he was dismissed from Bungie for very questionable behaviour, He'd said that the game was kind of aimed at being a tense living world experience filled with co-op player stories and the potential of danger of other players, but that extraction was a kind of convenient mechanic leveraged to create an identifiable gameplay loop, where players in the same session have multiple opportunities to succeed or fail. And it's interesting that Marathon could have potentially had these kind of persistent servers, more of a live world feeling, and potentially even kind of more persistent progression over time. Maybe it would have had a better opportunity or a better identity as something unique if it had more of those components as opposed to being a hero extraction shooter, which is more of what we're actually going to get when Marathon drops. Maybe that will ultimately end up being a mistake for Marathon, or maybe not. So it's an interesting discussion. I do not believe that looter shooters are going to die out because there are loads of different ways to actually approach that broader genre. I do, however, think though, moving into the future, we're going to see them adapt and change, potentially into games that are more expansive than just the extraction shooter. And to an extent, you can kind of point to Destiny as an example of a game that is a looter shooter, has a lot of RPG components, has PvP, but is largely focused on PvE and occasionally combines the two. Plus, Lawless Frontier recently has a lot of components which are similar to extraction shooters. And much like the suggestion of Marathon being a more persistent live world type game, or at least Bungie targeting doing something like that, are possible examples of where this type of game will go in the future. I don't believe that studios will just pump out basic extraction shooters for years to come and them all be successful, the same way that they haven't been able to do it with looter shooters in the style of Outriders. And I guess that's ultimately the point of what I'm discussing here. It's about where these kind of loot-focused shooter games will ultimately end up going. You'll have to give me your thoughts on that bit below. But, genre differences aside, one of the big reasons that Arc Raiders is successful is that the gameplay mechanics, the loop, the sandbox, is really fun, and it combines those elements of there being risk and reward, and producing that feeling of, I'll play one more match, right, even when you know you shouldn't. And in a lot of ways, that's what many of these looter shooter type games have missed out on, right? Fundamentally, when Destiny came out, it was not a brilliant game originally, but it had all the kind of foundations of something that could be really good, right? Bungie obviously excelling on the gameplay side, the way that guns feel, being in a first-person shooter, but then also having crazy abilities. That was Bungie's foundation, and that's ultimately the reason that Destiny didn't just die. Most of the other looter shooters that we've actually seen fundamentally didn't have that foundation there, right? And in addition to the gameplay not being anywhere near on the level that we see with the games that have survived over the years, Warframe is a great example of that. A lot of those games also just didn't have the sheer amount of content, progression, investment, social game that those other successful games have had. There have certainly been too many attempts at copying other people's homework, so to speak, which hasn't done the genre many favors, I guess. So that's why I think some of the content that we've seen in Destiny, when it's Gambit or Lawless Frontier, it creates that unique gameplay action. And even then, it's just a very small part of an expansive world like Destiny. And I believe that the opportunity is still there, but as we've said, it's a very difficult thing to get all of the elements together, cooking at the right time and in the right ways. Big question for us who track Bungie is whether they can kind of bottle some of that magic with Marathon. You'll have to give me your thoughts below, but generally, I'd love to hear any memories you have of games like Anthem, the other shooter games that have turned up over the years, whether it's Outriders, First Descendant, and share your thoughts as well about how you feel the future could go in this space. Bit of a general discussion thing today, but if you've enjoyed it, a rating would really help us out on the channel. Be sure as well to hit subscribe and I'll keep you up to date with Destiny and who knows, maybe broader gaming news. But for now, cheers for tuning in, and I hope you have an awesome day.